So hello everybody, I'm Felix Wemheuer and this is my YouTube channel Studying Maoist China, and today we have a distinguished guest here is Jason M. Kelly. Hello Jason.
Hey Felix, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, great to be here. So we want to talk about your new book here on this channel. It's Market Maoists, the Communist Origins of China's Capitalist Ascent. And it came out with Harvard University Press in 2021. And Jason is assistant professor for strategy and policy development at the US Naval War College, Newport in Rhode Island. But I hear that you will move to Wales, right?
That's correct. Yep, heading over to Cardiff University. Very excited about it this summer.
Yeah, and Jason received his PhD in history from Cornell University, and prior to joining the faculty, he was a fellow at the Harvard Kennedy School of Government and a US Foreign Service officer. Now I start with my first question. In the Western media, we often hear narratives that Mao's China was isolated and delinked itself from the world market. After reform and opening under the leadership of Deng Xiaoping in 1978, China would have opened up to the world, so this narrative. In your book, you are arguing that you consider reform and opening not simply as a rise of capitalism in China, but rather a continuation of CCP policies under new historical circumstances to use access to global markets and capital investments to achieve political aims. Please explain in more detail, what do you mean by that?
Okay, that's a great starting point. Thank you, Felix, and thank you again for having me. I'm glad you had a copy of the book. I'm embarrassed that I don't have my own copy to showcase today. So the book, the argument that I'm trying to make is that a lot of the ideas and the policy outlooks and policy frameworks that emerged in the Mao era continued to frame how the Chinese Communist Party both thought about itself, but also explained or characterized the relationship between China and markets all over the world into the reform and opening era, and well beyond, all the way up to the present. And when I say policies, I don't mean rigid sort of set policies, but I mean more kind of flexible policy frameworks that are capable of stretching and adapting to suit different historical contexts the way that they have. So for example, when Deng Xiaoping uses the expression 平等互利, equality and mutual benefit, he's invoking a Mao-era concept that has deep historical roots to the early PRC period, just the way Xi Jinping is when he uses that same phrase. And so what the book does is it tries to trace the emergence of these original policy frameworks and then show how they're still relevant today after reform and opening.
In your book, you show that the Chinese government in the early 1950s wanted to get involved in global trade. Some private capitalists and Western European countries were interested in signing contracts and trade agreements with the PRC. However, the US government imposed an embargo against the PRC in the context of the Korean War and tried to prevent that allied countries, for example, Japan, would do trade with socialist China. Johanna Böckmann argued that during Cold War, socialist states and newly independent states often demanded free trade, while the US government enforced embargoes, especially for high technology and military goods. Do you consider self-isolation of the PRC or the US pressure on the allies a major reason that Chinese foreign trade with the Western world developed only slowly in the 1950s?
Yeah, so that's another great question. My answer to that, I don't even know, this may not be a fair answer, but my answer is both, honestly. I do think it is actually a combination of the two, because on the one hand, the embargo really did have a massive impact on Chinese trade policy, particularly during the 1950s when it was at its sort of height. And that's particularly true in the context of China's attempts to import things like advanced technology and industrial goods, capital goods from European markets, for example, or Japan. And we know that this was a genuine interest to trade despite the embargo on the CCP part or the PRC part, was because we have ample evidence of pretty elaborate smuggling mechanisms and regimes that were designed to circumvent the embargo. But we also know from internal Chinese Communist Party documents at the time that there was a genuine, consistent push to expand trade despite the embargo. So there was a push for sort of freer trade in the context of the embargo. But at the same time, there's also evidence of of a selective self-isolation, I think, that was at the heart of CCP trade policy during the Mao years. And that's because there's this persistent fear of dependency that might accompany excessive trade. And that dependency could breed a kind of vulnerability that just didn't sit well with first generation Chinese Communist Party leaders. And so there was this tension at the heart of Maoist trade, where there was a desire to trade and to expand trade, but also this impulse to control it and ensure that it didn't get out of control, because the fear was that it could undermine the Chinese Revolution itself if left unchecked. And even maybe more importantly, it could undermine the Chinese Communist Party's own stature as the final decider of the direction of the revolution, right? So to go back to Professor Bachman's observations about the calls for the demands for free trade by socialist states and socialists at the time, that's absolutely the case. I would agree with that for Chinese PRC officials too. But one thing to keep in mind is there was a political value to these calls as well, right? And so in many cases, this call was used, I don't want to say cynically, but for a particular political purpose, which was to contrast China's and the socialist world more open embrace of trade for all states with the embargo itself as a sort of exclusive, exclusionary approach that capitalist imperialists were taking at the time. The most famous example of that, I think, is the Moscow International Economic Conference in April of 1952, which was billed as this big opportunity to expand cross-curtain east-west trade. And that's true. And there were deals signed and there was a genuine commitment to this, but it was also used and seen as an opportunity for undermining the United States, driving wedges between the United States and its allies and undermining the embargo itself. So that's an important context to keep in mind as well. And another thing I would say too is that one of the real limitations as well to expanding trade during the early years of the PRC was simply financial, right? I mean, the PRC was only able to earn so much through exports because of the embargo and because of the nature of the Chinese economy. And there were real concerns, which we can talk about later, about debt financing and being indebted to capitalists. And so that placed very hard limits on the amount of trade that the PRC could actually engage in at the time. So the upshot is that I think it's a combination of all of these different factors that help to limit the scope and the pace of trade expansion at the time.
In my work regarding the Great Leap Forward, Famine argues that grain imports from Canada and Australia in 1961 and 62 played a key role to end starvation. China imported an amount of grain in these years that was enough to feed important cities on the East Coast, such as Beijing, Shanghai, and Tianjin. I always wondered how the Chinese state could afford these imports, if you just mentioned the problem, right, of financial restraint, and how they were organized. Could you explain it in more detail to us? So this is also, I think, great in your book that you also present many details on personal continuities, but also in institutional continuities and how it all worked in particular cases.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. That's one of my favorite stories in the book, honestly, the story of this grain import program, because it shows so well two different sides of the Chinese Communist Party at the time. Like on the one hand, you've got this really, I think, remarkable flexibility and ability to change to meet a crisis and adaptability because of the crisis. And then on the other hand, you see that the crisis itself was generated largely by the rigidities of the Chinese Communist Party. So there's two sides of Maoist governance are evident in the story, which makes it so interesting. But to go back to kind of the broader story, I think it's important first to look at the context. So there are two big things to keep in mind, I think, when trying to understand this grain import program. The first is the context of the Great Leap Forward, right? And obviously at this point, by early 1960, it's clear to top Chinese officials, including trade officials, that there are significant problems and that there are signs of famine. The scope, maybe not entirely clear. Felix, you know more about this subject than I do for sure. But we do know that Li Xiannian was aware that, who went on to play a key role in orchestrating this grain import program. He was very aware that something had to be done to address the grain shortfalls and the food problems that were cropping up all around the country. And so he knew that there's a need for some sort of concerted action in the first half of 1960. So that's a first contextual thing to keep in mind. The second one, I think, is the Sino-Soviet split, right? So as you know, right, for the second half of the 1950s, Sino-Soviet relations were getting worse and worse, and until by the summer of 1960, things became particularly acrimonious, right? And in July, the Soviets informed the Chinese government, the MFA, that they would be withdrawing technical and economic advisors almost immediately before September 1st. And these Soviet advisors would essentially be walking off of half-completed projects, which didn't bode well for future trade relations between the two. And so because of that, in the context of this emerging economic crisis and the famine, that limited the options that the Chinese Communist Party leaders at the time saw in terms of how looking for outside assistance to resolve the grain problem that they were facing at the time. And it's important, I think, too, to note that at the outset, Li Xiannian didn't really see this as the crisis as profound as it was. His approach was initially to sort of tinker at the margins. And so this was seen as sort of a logistical problem that China could address domestically by transferring grain from supposed surplus areas to what he called disaster areas, right? Zaiqu. And that this might remedy the problem. But by the summer, when the Sino-Soviet relationship comes apart almost as extremely as it would, it's clear that that's insufficient, that like a domestic transferring of grain resources would not really resolve this problem because of its scope and scale. Others realized it at the time. Chen Yun raises the idea early on of importing grain from capitalist markets. This is kind of where the story picks up for the import program. And he raises this idea with the Ministry of Grain, and it's a bold proposal to make at the time, right? Because this isn't too far after the Lushan dispute, and it's very clear that there could be consequences for deviating from the proper line. So Chen Yun raises this idea of potentially importing grain from capitalist markets. And this was particularly sensitive because China had been a net grain exporter since 1949, because of the dependency fears that I mentioned earlier, the idea that China shouldn't be relying on foreign markets, foreign grain to feed its people. And so it had been a net grain exporter up until 1960 when this program takes off. And the news just continues to get worse as 1960 wears on, so that by October, when the harvest is mostly in, it's clear there's no windfall that's going to address the problem. It's going to help feed the people. And by November, it's in November that Li Xiannian finally proposes formally this idea of importing grain from capitalist countries. He proposes it to Zhou Enlai and Mao and others. And what's really amazing early on in this program is how quickly it moves up through the ranks. So Li Xiannian makes a proposal in late November. It's approved by Zhou Enlai on December 5th. Mao approves it a week later on December 12th. And the first shipments of Australian grain are in Chinese ports by February 2nd, 1961. So just less than 2 months later, right? So to get through that process of orchestrating and reaching out, finding the contracts, getting the shipping in order, all of this required addressing really 3 core challenges in very short order, right? And the first is the simple logistics of it, right? So they're talking about at the time millions of tons, metric tons of grain that would be imported for tens of millions of dollars, right? And to do this, the Ministry of Foreign Trade sets up a new trade office. It's called the Grain Import Leadership Small Group Office. It's got a great ring to it, the new office. That office works with China Resources, which started out, as I show in the book, it's a front company in Hong Kong. But they are based in Hong Kong still, and they have contacts throughout the capitalist world. And so this new grain office works with China Resources to reach out. China Resources reaches out to counterparts to initiate negotiations and to begin to sign contracts in short order. They have 2 negotiating groups, one for Australia, one for Canada. That makes sense because both countries had bumper harvests this year and they had complementary growing seasons, so you could import grain on a regular basis. And the party also, China Resources also reaches out and starts to begin signing leases for vessels to ship the grain all within weeks. Complicating all this is this desire for secrecy at the same time, right? We could talk about that later if there's time, but the party is very careful not to reveal its hand in these negotiations, which slows down the process somewhat. But still, they're able to do this to some extent without slowing it down to the point where we're talking about months and months of delays. The second big challenge is financing, like you said. How do you pay for this, right? This is all the trade balance was not great before the start of the grain program, and the program was eventually cost millions of US dollars or the equivalent. So how do you pay for it? And the initial answer to that was to squeeze for more exports, but that only takes you so far. Selling off gold and silver stocks of precious metals also can be used as a sort of boost to generate some additional foreign currency at the time. But at the end of the day, really the only solution was some form of debt, which was anathema to the party at the time, particularly debt to capitalists abroad for all of the obvious reasons at the time. But that was the only alternative, and it shows you how desperate the situation was. And so that's what makes this grain story. Another big shift is that we see Chinese Communist Party negotiators, China Resources negotiators, agreeing to policies and agreeing to contracts where they pay just a percentage, usually 25% cash upfront, and then agree to pay the balance within 270 days. So these are short-term, fairly everyday loans to finance the purchases, but it's a big shift for the Chinese Communist Party because of its fear of dependency, which I mentioned earlier. And the third big challenge is ideology. How do you explain this policy? And I think how do you explain not just the reliance on capitalist markets, but also the departure from food sufficiency? And the solution that Li Xianyan and others come up with is really twofold. One is to explain it away as temporary, right? This isn't a significant lasting policy change. It's a temporary expedient is how it's framed consistently over time. And the second part is to stress the victimhood element, right? Which kind of rhymes with the larger justification or the explanation for the Great Leap Forward itself, right? So China's been a victim of floods and droughts and natural disasters. And when the import program and the shift to imports of grain from abroad, in this narrative, when it's framed this way, the party becomes this sort of the heroes of the moment, right? They're the ones who were flexible and adaptable and did manage to secure these imports in short order and begin to start feeding starving people, which is true. I mean, that's true as far as it goes. The challenge is that when you step back and you look at the larger context of the Great Leap itself, as you know, there are a lot of rigid policies that produced the crisis in the first place. So again, it goes back to what I originally said. It's this combination of adaptability and flexibility, but also rigidity that are both wrapped up in this story, which makes it so interesting.
Sure, it would have been much better when they would decide to import grain 1 year earlier, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And also they still exported grain, right, in 59 and early 1960. Yeah, it was a very important shift, right? And as we know, it was not temporary because it also went then on even in some years during the Cultural Revolution.
That's right. What's shocking too is in 1959, like you said, the Ministry of Foreign Trade actually collected beyond the plan for its expected grain exports for the year.
Yeah, and Zhou Enlai was in charge of it, so it also contradicts his perception as a people's premier, right? Yeah. So the next question is, recently some scholars are questioning the narrative of the 1978 divide, and they're emphasizing strong continuities between Maoist China and the development after reform and opening under Deng in the 1980s. You show that already in 73, the government set up a plan to buy technology from capitalist countries worth $4.3 billion in only 3 to 5 years. It seems that by that point of time, the government had realized that China would be unable to catch up with the West if they continue the strategy of self-reliance. Why did the plan not work out?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I think the first thing I would say is I think the CCP never actually abandoned the notion of ziligang or self-reliance itself, right? And one of the points I try to stress in the book is that self-reliance never, as you know, never meant autarky. It just meant never trusting China's fate to outsiders, to non-party sources, right? So trade, in other words, can expand and it can contract, provided it doesn't threaten the party's political objectives or the revolution itself at the time, right? So I think there are many reasons why the sort of Maoist conservative understanding of ziligang didn't work out. I think one of the most important ones is just the changing international context, right? So as I mentioned before, the Sino-Soviet split removed a key source of technology and capital that the Chinese Revolution perceived as a requirement for China's modernization and its revolutionary objectives, right? And that split also helped to spur US-China rapprochement in the early 1970s, which that very process itself, I think, raised a lot of really difficult ideological questions and some soul searching about what China's path to communism would look like and what socialism in the Chinese context would actually look like relative to its original conceptions, right? Because of these changes in the world. I think that interacted with changes inside of China at this time, right? So by the early 1970s, I think by and large, for many people, including members of the party, the sort of revolutionary bloom was off the rose, right? After it's been 2 decades of Chinese Communist Party rule, the party hadn't yet shown an ability to raise living standards and meet the expectations of everyday people in the ways that it had initially promised. So there wasn't much to celebrate at the time, and the prosperity hadn't materialized. I think also on top of that, you have the chaos of the Cultural Revolution, which dented the prestige of the regime. And on top of that, you have the Lin Biao affair, which I think is particularly important to challenging kind of earlier conceptions of what the revolution meant and what socialism would be in the Chinese context. And all of these things, I think, converged to force a real reconsideration among top trade officials and senior leaders in the party in the early 1970s. I think Chen Yun is probably one of the best examples of that, because it's clear that he recognized that the path didn't look the way that it was originally presumed to look for China's path toward revolutionary statehood, right? And so because it hadn't worked out, new alternatives had to be considered. And he's considering these new alternatives, as others are, in the context of 2 decades at this point of limited but still important commercial interaction with markets, capitalist markets, outside the socialist bloc markets, that can help kind of shape the way, and did help shape the way he thought about, and other party officials thought about, what an alternative path might look like for China's economic development. And I think that reconsideration in the early 1970s is a really key part of the path to reform and opening as it ultimately happened.
Yeah, so your book is called Market Maoist. I think it works as a provocation. However, I think that already Lenin and the Bolsheviks argued that as long as a capitalist world would exist, a socialist state needs to trade, especially to get access to better technology. And for example, Soviet Russia signed the famous Rapallo Treaty with Germany in 1922. Do you think that socialism and global trade are in contradiction, as the title might suggest? Or under what circumstances did integration into the world market led to capitalism? You already described the changes in the early 1970s, but by what point or what policies really led to kind of this capitalist change in China?
Yeah. You're absolutely right. The title is certainly a provocation. It was intended as one, and not just to grab readers' attention or for poetic purposes, but also because part of the goal was to try to get readers to focus on how they think about the way that these two terms, markets and Maoists, fit together before reading the book, and then I'm hoping that they will keep it in their minds as they read through the book, and then afterward to see if they still see it as a contradiction themselves. I think, of course, you're right too. Lenin and Soviet leaders recognized early on that trade would continue and should continue between the socialist world and capitalist states as long as capitalist states existed. And I think CCP leaders certainly felt the same way. And so because of that, I actually don't think that socialism and global trade are necessarily in contradiction. And I think, but I do think that there are important tensions that exist between Chinese socialism and global trade. And it's important to keep these tensions in mind if we're trying to understand Chinese commercial diplomacy during the Mao era, during the Reform and Open era, and then even all the way up to the present, because in particular, the kind of nut of the problem is the extent to which China is able to engage in global trade and to tap into the resources, the capital, the technology, the knowledge, the organization principles of capitalism without ceding ultimate political control and without relinquishing control over the direction of China's modernization and political development. And that's been at the heart, I think, of Chinese commercial diplomacy throughout the CCP era since the inception, without any exceptions. The second, so there's no contradiction, I guess, to underscore that point as far as I see it. Now, there is a tension, though. On the second question about the kinds of circumstances in which integration into world markets leads to capitalist development, I think part of the answer involves this sort of changing character of the Chinese Revolution in the post-Mao era, like what I was talking about before, the sort of hollowing out of that original revolutionary ethos and a shift to new conceptions of what socialism might look like in the Chinese context. That combined with the disillusionment that I was talking about as well, which sort of removed key parts of the foundation of socialism as it was originally conceived in Mao's China. And I think that process did a lot to shape the circumstances that influenced how China integrated into the world market when it eventually did to a much greater degree, right, in the 1970s and the 1980s and 90s. The other point that obviously that integration process was wildly successful. China's become one of the, it has ascended in a global capitalist context by many different metrics, right? So that's not news to anybody here. But I do think the jury's still out to an extent on what kind of economic development China is pursuing today, even after so much of its world market integration, right? Because there are elements of capitalism, private ownership of some means of production, a significant role for markets, price signaling to distribute and allocate resources and goods. But there's also, I think there are practices that diverge from common conceptions of what capitalism is or what we associate with capitalist contexts and development. And the most important one, I think, is the party's willingness to intervene unilaterally in markets if it feels threatened, if it feels that there's a potential for instability or challenges to party supremacy, right? And so I think because of that, it's fair to conclude that the CCP has incorporated some aspects of capitalism into its development model that have produced the growth that we've all seen over the past couple of decades. But it's not clear to me whether that will necessarily continue in the years ahead. I'm a historian, obviously, so I'm much more comfortable looking back rather than forward.
Yeah. So maybe they were too successful, right? So now they're talking about sanctions and embargo and so on again. Yeah. Thanks a lot for this interesting interview. Yeah, and
thank you so much for having me, Felix.
Yeah, thank you. Have a nice day.
You too. Take care.
Bye.